I'm going to begin with two quotations. The first is from Charles Stein, who has recently translated some of the Hermetic works. Ontologies cover being. They render it, allowing a view of being to appear as being in its entirety, while in the same act covering it over, so that being itself, now characterized by its covering, is placed under ellipse or occultation. Being never appears as it is in itself, but instead allows appearances to arise that cover it. But even that truth about being is occulted when any specific take, any figure for being, indeed an ontology, is asserted positively or absolutely. And the second quotation is from Antoine Favre. Wherever Hermes passes, religious tolerance prevails. The story of Hermes Trismegistus, thrice greatest Hermes, is a Gordian knot for historians of religion, philosophers, and for anyone wishing to learn from the Hermetic teachings and discern a path for doing so. There are three distinguishable problems involved in any attempt to understand this tradition. First is the problem of just what a religion is. Second, there is the problem of what the Hermetic teachings actually are. And third, how does one make those teachings meaningful in one's life? The first problem arises from attempts to define religion in general. The idea of a religious way of life is as old as humanity. But the variety of these ways, both those now past and those still followed today, is such that any attempted definition is too narrow to include all traditions and practices that are religious, or they are so broad that they include much that we would not call religions. The very idea of a religion is comparatively recent, and it arises from the Christian tradition. As Christianity developed, it drifted toward emphasizing belief over experience. And so religion came to be seen as a body of beliefs and practices that embodied those beliefs. Yet there are ancient and modern religious traditions in which belief is not central. Recognizing this fact, some scholars attempted to define religion in terms of practices which represented, and perhaps gave rise to, myths. But today, many individuals shun specific practices and yet are religious. The attempt to discern a religion and what it essentially is has supported much work in anthropology, sociology, theology, and philosophy. This has given rise to a debate over ethic and emic, study of various societies, including their religious understanding that affects the thinking, worldviews, and structure of those societies. The ethic view is the effort to study a society or community from the outside. That is, observing its members and their activities without in any way participating in them. This stance includes the view that involvement in what is being studied distorts one's findings, for in becoming involved, one's objectivity is compromised. The emic view recognizes that one cannot understand a community without entering into its social and subjective worldview. Hence, the so-called objective understanding from the outside is no real understanding at all, but rather merely a conceptual framework imposed on what is studied. Both approaches are found in the studies of the teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus and to the whole Hermetic strain that has come through Western culture down to the present. The second problem, what did Hermes Trismegistus actually teach, can only be approached by deciding on which of several options to take. One, the first option is to look for the earliest texts associated with Hermes Trismegistus. Two, the second option is to examine teachings attributed to Hermes Trismegistus beyond those texts. And three, the third option is to look at the whole historical stream of Hermetic thought throughout Western history down to the present. For our purposes, we will focus on the early texts and only reference other teachings and the historic stream as appropriate in this focus. The third problem, how to apply those teachings to one's life in some meaningful way, will deeply concern us in this presentation. The problem of just what religion is will not concern us, for it may be a non-problem. To use an example, Christianity has fragmented into countless traditions. One naturally thinks of the many Protestant churches, but Catholicism also contains numerous divisions, not only of orders, sometimes opposed to one another, but of great differences in practices across the globe. In fact, each self-identified Christian has his or her understanding of the chosen tradition, since the meaning of that tradition is saturated with an individual's own experience, how he or she was raised, how educated, what life experiences have been assimilated, and so on, so that there are as many Christianities as there are Christians. Obviously, they overlap, combine, and twist around one another, but like fingerprints, no two individual understandings are exactly alike. The same is true of the other great traditions, religious traditions of the world, present and past, and of the less widespread ones as well. In one important sense, there are as many religions as there are religious people in the world. The same would have been true of the early Hermetics, and certainly is true of those down the centuries who saw themselves as Hermetic followers. This realization allows us the freedom to ignore any attempt to delimit too sharply the religion of Hermes Trismegistus. Rather than thinking of a religion in some well-defined tradition, we can think of a spiritual stream meandering from a source, which may be unknown, down through the ages. That stream was understood in various ways from the earliest times we can discern. Like all streams, it becomes muddy, that is, tainted, at times, and is more pure at others. The idea of a spiritual stream is what lies behind those who hold that there's a source for all religious traditions, a philosophia perennis that is within and behind them. The historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, tended toward this view and argued for it in many writings. He wrote, "The structure of this holy and transcendent universe varies according to a man's culture and religion, for all conceptualization is irremediably linked with language and consequently with culture and history. One can say that the meaning of the supernal light is directly conveyed to the soul of the man who experiences it. And yet this meaning can only come fully to his consciousness clothed in a pre-existent ideology. Here lies the paradox. The meaning of the light is, on the one hand, ultimately a personal discovery, and on the other, each man discovers what he was spiritually and culturally prepared to discover. End of quote. This approach to religion and religions invites comparisons, and it has provoked strong reactions. Some scholars, in what universities call religious studies, have gone to great lengths to show the differences in religions. This, of course, is the etic debate in another register. It is easy to show differences in religion, from the seeming polytheism of Hinduism to the alleged atheism of Buddhism. Yet we also know that there are as many differences in each major religion as there are between religions. Wouter J. Hanegraaff, professor of history of Hermetic philosophy and related currents at the University of Amsterdam, one of the few departments in the world devoted to esoteric traditions, rejects what he calls religionism. This approach is exemplified in Mircea Eliade's work. Eliade is convinced that there is something in religion that is real and fundamental to human nature and the cosmos, a conviction that easily leads to belief in a philosophia perennis, or at least to the Renaissance idea of a prisca theologia, a primordial theology. The view that the ancient philosophers, East and West, anticipated through revelatory insights the advent of Christianity, the culmination of spiritual truth. Though the terms are sometimes used synonymously, philosophia perennis is the more general view of a spiritual impulse that pervades all religions, each of which is a partial expression of it cast in terms of various cultures and times. Hanegraaff shuns this view. He also rejects other scholars who examine religions from the standpoint that they are all mere myths in the sense of stories humanity has told itself. Put bluntly, in this view, they are not true, though they have explanatory power to affect lives and cultures. Hanegraaff takes a middle course, neither affirming a spiritual unity nor denying the truth of religious claims. Rather, he wants to investigate what a religious position means for those who hold it, including what it means for the lives they live. Truth for him is as elusive as any concept of the ultimate nature of existence. Put another way, he takes the Hermetic texts seriously and wants to discover what they mean for those who imbibe them. The natural question to ask is, who was Hermes Trismegistus? This is not an easy question to answer. Throughout history, Hermetic disciples and scholars have wrestled with this question, and the answers have varied widely. One common and ancient view was that Hermes received an illumination from the source of all existence, sometimes called God and sometimes the highest logos, and he thus became known as Trismegistus, thrice greatest. He taught his son Asclepius, who then taught his son Tot. Such teaching, leading to initiations such as Hermes Trismegistus had. We remember that the idea that the divine entered the human sphere is an old one. The ancient Greek families trace their origins back to one or another god. Alexander the Great, after his visit to the oracle of Zeus in Egypt's Siwa oasis, believed that his real father was Zeus and not Philip II of Macedon. And Mary's son Jesus had God as his father. In one way or another, the ancient Mediterranean world is familiar with the idea that the divine entered, or even engendered, remarkable, enlightened human beings. Some thought that Hermes Trismegistus was a contemporary of Moses, others that he came before or after. Others held that he was a god, an incarnation of the Greek Hermes and the Egyptian Thoth, whom were thought to be equivalent. Both gods were said to have taught humanity writing, metallurgy, and agriculture, all the fundamental elements of civilization. Others thought that Hermes Trismegistus was an enlightened sage who lived in the earliest historic times and taught in Egypt. Yet others thought there were two Hermes, one the god and the other human. And a later writer even identified 5 Hermes. One reason for these various views is that the Hermetic texts do not seem to be written by a single individual. For example, some seem to be theistic, and others point to a source beyond any conception of God one might entertain. The second natural question is what are the writings attributed to Hermes? From the beginning to the Christian era, such writings were known and thought of as already ancient. Early Christian fathers referred to them, including Origen, Clement of Alexandria, Lactantius, and Justin Martyr. They saw these works as anticipating Jesus as the Christ and hence leading people to Christianity. Later orthodoxy, including St. Augustine of Hippo, rejected them as devilish distractions. As a consequence, the Western Middle Ages knew only of one text, the Asclepius, which centered on medicine, while the Byzantine world preserved a number of texts. At some point, these texts were gathered together into about 18 treatises known as the Corpus Hermeticum, the body of Hermetic writings. Some of these and other works survived only in old Middle Eastern languages, such as Syriac and Armenian. With the conquest of most of the Byzantine Empire by Islamic states after about 650 of the Common Era, Hermes was translated into Arabic, along with other texts attributed to Hermes or to the Hermetic tradition. Because much of Spain was Muslim for several centuries, over time these Arabic works were translated into Hebrew and Latin, and they entered the Western Roman world through France and Germany, though they were not well known in Italy. Italy, however, received the Corpus Hermeticum at the height of the Renaissance in the 15th century and was translated by Marsilio Ficino, who also translated the works of Plato, both brought from Byzantium a little earlier. Because all these writings came from 2 different places, Northern Europe was enthused by the texts from Arabic, and the Italian world was excited over the Greek texts from Byzantium. As a consequence, the Hermetism of Northern Europe strongly focused on its texts, which were alchemical and medical in nature, while the South focused on the more philosophical texts. In this way, the Hermetic stream was largely divided. We will focus on the more philosophical works because they suggest much about the nature of Hermetic spirituality. The alchemical side is not, of course, entirely divorced from the philosophical side. The famous Magdalene or emerald tablet, allegedly discovered in a cave, states that what is above is like what is below, and vice versa, the key to the one work. The microcosm reflects, indeed is an embodiment of, the macrocosm. The human being embodies the whole cosmos in miniature. Alchemists took the one work to be the discovery of the philosopher's stone, which would turn any substance into gold. Scholars have tended to treat alchemy as a precursor of chemistry, and there is much truth in this view. They thought that considering alchemy with personal transformation was a post-Renaissance development, and this is not so. The spiritual dimension of alchemy was present from the first. In the late 3rd century, Zosimos of Panopolis, an alchemist, wrote letters to Theosebia, an alchemist in Egypt who was engaged in teaching esoteric alchemy to a circle of students. Some letters survive, and what they make clear is that alchemy first involved the transmutation of substances into gold and the search for the philosopher's stone, but that this activity was a waste of time unless, second, a parallel mental and spiritual transmutation took place. The outer activity was seen as one with the inner activity. And so both mental attitude and a purified ethical nature was required for inner and outer success. Otherwise, Zosimus wrote, alchemy would be demonic, that is, would produce dangerous results for the alchemists and for the world. For some time, Hermetic thought of both the philosophical and alchemical kinds pervaded philosophical and religious thinking throughout Europe. But then in 1614, Isaac Casaubon, born a Huguenot in France, educated in Geneva, and ultimately dying in London, published his famous critique of Hermetic writings. Though a deeply religious Protestant, he had become a classical scholar and philologist, one of the first in the modern sense of the word. He showed that the language of the Hermetic writings was not that of the 2nd or 3rd centuries of the Common Era, and not ancient. Since so much of the authority of the Hermetic teachings depended upon the conviction that they were ancient and even pre-Christian, this discovery dealt a fatal blow to a general appreciation of the Hermetic works. From this time on, Hermetic thought went underground, so to speak, driven even deeper by the Enlightenment, which, in its most robust form, rejected all religion, and certainly anything that smelled of myth, on the altar of reason. To make a long story short, only 3 points need to be made. The first is that Hermetic thought did not disappear. The alchemical Hermetism of Northern Europe continued in many places, and one can see its effects in the writings of Paracelsus and Jakob Boehme, both of whom inspired generations of followers. Because the Hermetic teachings honored in Southern Europe were more philosophical, their influence was even more obscured. The second point is that philology and related studies since Casaubon's time, and especially within the last century or so, have become more sophisticated. Scholars now know that, though the texts can be no earlier than perhaps the late 1st century and mostly from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, they contain older, reworked material, some of which may be much older. The third point relates to the 19th and early 20th century views. Especially with the rise of positivist thinking, deriving from the materialism of the sciences since the 18th century, scholars generally thought that the Hermetic writings had nothing to do with Egypt. The texts are in Greek, and no Egyptian versions have been found. Hence, the so-called Egyptian nature of the doctrines were not really Egyptian at all. Put simply, the Hermetic story is false. But more recently, scholars have re-examined the texts and found much of ancient Egypt in them. Thus, their origin has at least been in part returned to Egypt. These 3 points would require much additional material to demonstrate conclusively, but we'll leave them at this. So what does Hermes Trismegistus teach? The Corpus Hermeticum does not say a great deal about cosmology, the origin of the world, and it speaks more about the human condition and the path of freedom from the world of strife and suffering. The Poimandres, the first text, in the Corpus Hermeticum does connect the origin of all existence with the human condition. It begins with Hermes reporting, and I'm quoting, "I was thinking about everything. Suddenly my mind shot up and my senses everted, but not as in a stupor, not drunk or sated. And it seemed to me that something very big, completely unbounded, immeasurable, called my name." Hermes, who will come to be called Hermes Trismegistus, here begins to tell us how he came to his divine knowledge. Deep in thought about many things, his mind mysteriously transcends its ordinary thinking, and his senses are turned inside out. This withdrawal of the senses from their normal outward attention to within himself opens him to the presence of a reality quite beyond conceptual grasp. In calling Hermes' name, it both directs itself to Hermes and draws Hermes' attention to it. The human and the divine are joined in what becomes a dialogue. The voice asks Hermes what the voice asks what Hermes wants to know. And unsurprisingly, Hermes asks the question, "Who are you?" And this immensity answers, "I am the Poimandres, the mind of the authentic one." To this Hermes replies that he wants to know everything. And Poimandres gives him just that in general terms. First, everything is turned to mild light, but then a downward tending darkness appears, and from it an inarticulate sound, likened to wailing. The darkness becomes a churning, watery fluid, but then, quote, "From the light a holy word came out, and it stood on the watery nature. So it seemed to me this word was the voice of the light." Poimandres asks if Hermes understands what he is witnessing. Hermes, of course, does not at this point. So Poimandres tells him, and I quote, "That light," he said, "I am it, mind, the first God. He who was before the watery nature came out of the dark, and the one that came out of the light is the Logos, the word son of this God." And suddenly the heart of this cosmology begins to manifest. Poimandres says, again quoting, "Know by looking at, by listening to that which is in you, that the word is the son of the mind, and that they do not stand apart from each other, for life is the oneness of them." Life is the utter unity of mind and word, and so of light. This is the key to all that follows. Hermes then explains that as he looked at the light, he saw innumerable powers within it, a world without limit, and he says that, "I knew these things through seeing the word of Poimandres." Here, light and sound are one, the situation before creation, which is affirmed when Poimandres says, "In your mind, you now know the archetypal form, the first before the first, the apeiron, the limitless." The four elements begin to distill out of the watery fluid, water, fire, air, and earth. The first mind is now seen as having a double nature, a polarity that will eventually manifest as the two sexes. Combining that polarity, a second mind is born, and it is the creator of the world, the artifacts. It forms the seven directors, which are the seven planets, or rather, being formed out of spirit and fire, are the beings we see as the seven planets. Their orbiting together constitutes harmony, usually translated fate. As Hanegraaff puts it, Harmony is the astral machinery of necessity, or fate in quotes. Now that everything is in place, the word, logos, leaves nature, and the elements fashion the world with its flora and fauna, but without logos. But the father mind, the first mind, formed anthropos, the archetype of the human being, complete with all the powers of that mind. Anthropos saw the work of the artifacts, the second mind, and was given permission to create as well. Looking into nature, nature responded. She fell in love with Anthropos and reflected his image as in a mirror. Anthropos descended through the spheres of the directors, the planets, and entered mindless nature. And here we quote, and that is why Anthropos, humanity, like all other things that live on earth, has a double nature, being mortal according to its body, and immortal because it is anthropos, immortal, with dominion over everything, but suffering like a mortal also, cast down under fate. Having entered nature with the powers of the seven directors, nature produced seven persons, each one with one of the seven powers predominant, formed of the elements, feminine earth, masculine water, spiritual air. The fiery light and life entered the seven as soul and mind. Life manifested as soul and light as mind. At first, each person was androgyne, both male and female in one, and this lasted, and we quote, until the end of the epoch. Then in the next epoch, all creatures, including the human being, were separated into men and women. We are not told how this happened, but we might think of an analogy with the biological cell dividing itself. The incarnate anthropos, now divided, multiplied, and here we are. But the God let us know that we are immortal, and that desire is the cause of death, and we quote, but that whosoever knows himself has entered the good. So each of us is anthropos, as reflected and embodied, a spark of light and life, apparently separate because embodied, but one in that light and life which pervades all embodied existence is mind and soul. And we quote again, and she who has recognized herself has entered the blessed state, good beyond being. But to whosoever loves the body wanders in the darkness and knows death. Hermes is surprised by this statement, asking why those who do not recognize their true nature should be consigned to death. Poimandres does not answer directly, but rather demands that Hermes himself answer the question. Hermes realizes that it is darkness, which became watery, that forms the body. He also recognizes that, quote, the one who knows himself enters the good beyond being, because his source, the Father, is light and life, and those who know this return to what they ultimately are, the good itself. Now we come to the critical explanation of the human condition. Human beings who worship the body do not have mind in any active form. It stays away, or remains only as a potential for those who are greedy, envious, mockers, and worse. Mind withholds itself from those, that is, who identify with the limiting powers of the planets, through whom Anthropos descended in becoming embodied as living nature and human beings. But those who worship mind, who express spiritual love and sing songs of praise to the Father, with which they are ultimately one, will escape those limiting spheres and experience the immortality which is theirs. Upon death, the limiting conditions of embodiment will return to their own sources, quote, becoming a part of the cosmos to be combined again into another being. Here, death seems to mean transformation, for the initiation of Hermes here occurs in life. He is being freed from the body even while embodied. And we quote, but the man himself that remains after this dissolution of death goes up in sequence through the cosmic structure. The human being who knows himself or herself, though the human being who knows is neither male nor female in reality, ascends through those limiting spheres that correspond to the planets. Passing through the sphere of the moon, man relinquishes the energy that gives growth and decay. Passing Mercury, he surrenders cunning, and past Venus, he lets go of desire. Moving beyond Jupiter, he renounces arrogance and the will to dominate. And moving beyond Mars, he loses the tendency to precipitous, thoughtless intention and action. Passing Saturn, he surrenders greed and the lust for money. And going beyond the Sun, he surrenders bad faith, mendacity, and the wish to do harm. In rising beyond the spheres ruled by the 7 planets, the human being has escaped harmony, fate, the dynamics of those limiting conditions that characterize embodiment in nature. And we again quote, and then stripped naked of all that in him has become actual through the 7-fold harmonic of the cosmic structure, he takes to zone 8, the Ogdoad, in possession now of his own proper power. The proper power is, of course, the power of light and life itself. In the 8th sphere, which is beyond the spheres of the planets, apparently the sphere of the fixed stars, the human being who knows himself finds himself in the company of other knowers, all of whom sing praises of the Father who is in the 9th, formless sphere, the Ennead. Those in the Ennead have a unique voice, one voice with the source. Those in the Ogdoad can hear that unique voice and are drawn up into the Ennead, entering the good, of which no more can be said. Poimandres concludes, we quote, this is the goal, this the consummation, for those who have gone in now have gnosis, and are the knowers themselves. Poimandres now charges Hermes, for he has everything, to become a guide of the worthy, so that, quote, the generations of the Anthropos may be saved through you and the God. Having been so instructed, witnessing the truth of existence, Hermes becomes Hermes Trismegistus, the divine teacher of those human beings who are worthy, that is, who are willing to listen and to take to heart what they hear. What distinguishes those who hear and respond and those who do not seems to be conscience, the small voice that warns us not to do something or compels us to act where we see need. Those who ignore these promptings, and some even utterly suppress them, cannot heed the message Hermes Trismegistus has for humanity. Conscience is what opens us up to the possibility of deeper understanding if we nurture it and follow its guidance. For an unsullied consciousness is always ethical in its promptings. The first treatise of the Corpus Hermeticum thus gives us the worldview of the Hermetists. In broad terms, it gives us the origin of existence, the origin of humanity, the nature of unfolding existence, the dynamics of the human condition, how it became what it is, and the road to transcendence of limiting conditions and return to full realization of what each human being actually is. The remaining treatises, which we recall were probably gathered together long after they were written, deal with some details, but tend to deal with psychology and ethics, and so elaborate what is largely implicit here, but they do not say much about the cosmology itself. For some time, scholars tended to see Hermetism as a religion in competition with ancient paganism, Judaism, and Christianity. But this seems unlikely. The Hermetic thinkers did not form an institution and so developed no tradition of ruling on what was orthodox and what was heresy, nor did they have a mechanism for declaring certain writings as those of Hermes Trismegistus himself and others disciples. There was never a Bible, a list of authentic writings. Their organization was, so to speak, much looser. Individuals and groups traded documents and established practices that likely varied from group to group. Here one might think of the house churches of very early Christianity, where people gathered to reflect on the meaning of Jesus' teachings in the letters of St. Paul, which existed at least 2 decades before any Gospels appeared. Perhaps we should think of the traditions of what we call Hinduism, though that label is relatively recent, where a guru gathered disciples and taught them one or another way of thinking of reality, the human being, and the path to liberation from suffering. In both examples, the teachings would be united in spirit by general understanding, but the details would vary from teacher to teacher. No group likely possessed all the treatises found in the Corpus Hermeticum, and there's a lot of evidence that there were numerous texts now lost to us. As we say, very little is said about the Ogdoad and the Ennead in the Poimandres. When the Coptic Gnostic library was found in the middle of the last century in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, these texts from early centuries of Christianity included fragments from Plato and a previously unknown Hermetic work now called the Discourse on the Eighth and the Ninth. Here we find those who have reached the eighth, the Ogdoad, sphere singing. The words are largely strings of vowels, and hear the sound of the ninth sphere. It appears that the language of these higher spheres, beyond the zodiacal spheres, is a language quite beyond what we call language. Therefore, the representation in seemingly meaningless strings of vowels symbolically reflect in our language what is quite beyond it. Recall that the Word is a Son of God in the Poimandres, so that our speech is merely the diversity of the Word as it has descended through the spheres into nature and humanity, just as we are fragments, so to speak, of anthropos, so our languages are fragments of the Word. Is the cosmology of the 7 spheres to be taken literally? It is hard to say. We know that in early Christianity, some converts took the biblical text literally, and others found them to be allegorical and symbolic. From almost the beginning, some Christians thought the Bible was a veiled presentation of esoteric truths. The church father Origen, for example, in the early 3rd century, held that scriptures had to be read at 3 levels, literal, allegorical, and symbolic. Something like this is probably true of the Hermetic cosmology. Charles Stein says, belief in astrology is hardly the point, since it is one's conditioning, one's cognitive conditioning, as if astrologically, but really by any means, that one must achieve release from. And beginning with Poimandres' appearances to Hermes Trismegistus, this release involves initiation of some kind. An individual, when prepared, is given the truth of things, and this is liberating. Stein adds, initiation is a process of overcoming one's conditioning, a kind of disrobing of the psychic garments that cover a spirit whose true being is absolutely unconditioned. Since astrology symbolizes one's conditioning as is in fact to be discarded, it is not belief in astrology, really, but only in the conditioning that it symbolizes that requires one's intuitive understanding. The conditioned consciousness that binds us to the world we ordinarily experience, with all the limiting powers of the seven spheres in us as embodied beings and in nature as a whole, cannot reach beyond ordinary experience. Though it is only implicit in the opening lines of the Poimandres, other treatises indicate that a kind of meditation is involved. That is, one must make a concentrated effort to mentally reach beyond the conditioning, beyond the perceptions and conceptions of daily life, to a deeper or higher level of consciousness. When the senses are everted, turned within, consciousness is open to realization of what lies within and behind apparent reality. This is revelation, and it may seem to come from a higher being, though it is one's own efforts that allow the so-called revelation to occur. And as Poimandres says, we are ultimately that higher being. The remaining treatises frequently deal with this preparation and with unfolding revelation in the human being who senses that what he or she is lies beyond mundane experiences. In both the Corpus Hermeticum and the alchemical texts, self-purification is an ethical practice that is essential to real awareness and knowledge. Perhaps the most intriguing aspect of these ancient ideas is that the effort to realize one's real nature is not just for oneself. At the end of the discourse we have just considered, Poimandres instructs Hermes to share what he has realized with those who are worthy. And this Hermes, now Hermes Trismegistus, does just that in subsequent treatises. He teaches Asclepius and taught his sons in a spiritual sense, in some of them. For the sparks of light and life are in each human being, and those open to this fact can be awakened to their real nature. Those who are focused entirely on the body, that is, on personal embodiment and individual existence, will dismiss, even mock, such ideas. They can be left alone, for teaching them is a waste of energy and can only desecrate the sacred truth. For light and life, mind and soul, are sacred, being aspects of the authentic one. In teaching others, without invoking the planetary powers that give us arrogance and cunning and all the characteristics that make us believe we are separate and therefore alienated creatures, we open ourselves to even greater revelation. Here, revelation is direct experience, which means directly becoming what we learn. This is nothing more than stripping ourselves of the ultimately false characteristics of conditioned existence and becoming what we truly are, light and life itself, which is none other than the authentic one, the one reality behind, and so seemingly beyond, what we too easily take ourselves to be. Yet that one pervades both humanity and nature, and it is already within us, and hence is accessible as our real natures, if we make the effort to overcome the conditioning of consciousness. From these considerations, we can see why the Hermetic spirit has resonated through history, even though Hermetism, as a tradition, faded, was suppressed at times, and re-emerged in different cultural conditions and in new forms right down into the present. Unlike historians of ideas who trace historic links to and divergences from such ideas, there have always been those who have deeply sensed the spiritual meaning of such teachings and their promise for each individual and for humanity as a whole. Such an intuitive sense connects the individual with others and with nature, which connection requires an exercise of the most noble ethics, work with nature, and be of spiritual service to all human beings, even those who cannot notice such service, in pursuit of realization for oneself and all others. Put another way, this is conscience in its most active form. Unlike some systems that fall under the rather loose label of Gnosticism, there is no spiritual hierarchy here. The macrocosm is ultimately a total unity, and that unity is already in the microcosm, the human being, but in potential form, in that the individual must be awakened to it. But there is a hierarchy in spiritual attainment as individuals first realize the possibility of enlightenment and spiritual unity, and then in the struggle to pass through the seven spheres that separate us from realization of the divine. As Hermes Trismegistus shows through his own attainment, this return to the source and realization of our true nature is possible in life. Here, death is a metaphor for what must occur. In the language of St. Paul, the old man must die for the new man to be born, meaning that everything we mistakenly take ourselves to be must be stripped away so that we become the radiance that we potentially are. The spark returns to its source. An analogy might help here. Think of the Boston Marathon. While a few of the hundreds of participants may be aiming to win, the vast majority seek to fulfill the challenge of crossing the finish line. In the race, some will be faster and ahead of others, but that is not what matters. They are not aiming to win, but to complete the task. In this effort, a hierarchy temporarily seems to emerge, because some will be further along at any point in time. But that is an illusion of time, for all will cross the finish line, and that is what counts. So with the Hermetic teaching, some will be more spiritually advanced than others at any given time, and they can and are required to teach others. But it is only the goal that ultimately matters, and the goal exists beyond time. Hence, all are equal in the end, just as they were equal in the potential they had at the beginning. In this sense, we all belong to a spiritual democracy. But as in a political democracy, some of us will vote and others will not. Some of us will open ourselves and pursue our divine possibilities, while others will ignore them. That alone is what Hermes Trismegistus recognizes when he is charged to teach the worthy, that is, those who are prepared to listen. In attempting to understand the Hermetic or any other spiritual tradition, we are always confronted with the same question. Are we merely entertaining ourselves with the exotic beliefs of others? Or are we worthy to grasp what the tradition teaches? Thank you very much.